Okay, let's just talk for a minute about the resources that we're talking about. One of the calculations you can do is to say, okay, let's assume as a practical matter that we're going to consider three possible scenarios for transition to these lower carbon fuels. One is what you could call the business as usual scenario, where we, for the next 50 years, continue to increase our coal, gas, and oil consumption as we are now and grow our renewable and low carbon sources in the same way as well, increase at about 1.6% a year. And then after 50 years, we begin to phase out those fossil fuels with zero carbon energy sources of some mix, so that at the end of 100 years, we're supplying everybody in the world with the power that the average Frenchman enjoys, and we're doing it almost entirely with zero carbon or non-fossil fuel energy. So that's scenario one. Scenario two would be that we do the same thing, except that we grow the natural gas consumption much faster, so that we phase out coal in the first 50 years completely, and we hold oil constant. So we don't use any more oil than we do now, because we substitute with natural gas in transportation. And then in the second 50 years, we phase out the natural gas and the oil to the same point as in the first one. And the last case, we immediately start phasing out coal, oil, and natural gas with zero carbon energy sources and wind up at the same point as the others. Now, you can look at this in a couple of ways. Number one is in terms of CO2 emissions. As I mentioned, the middle scenario, the substitute gas, reduces the greenhouse warming by about 40 to 45% of what would be possible if you went to the zero carbon energy sources quickly, low carbon fast. The second point to be made, and that is, by the way, that's the biggest stabilization wedge that I've ever heard anybody talk about. People talk about these stabilization wedges, sort of conservation and various different ways of reducing in small slivers greenhouse warming. Well, this is the biggest sliver that I think has ever been talked about. But it's nothing new. I mean, people appreciate this for natural gas before. But the second way of looking at it is in terms of the fraction of the resource base that is consumed over these transitions. And the important point is that all of the transitions will consume a substantial fraction of the hydrocarbon resources, the fossil fuel resources that we have. And so on this sort of a scale, on this sort of 100-year time frame, we're going to be substantially transitioning from fossil fuels to other energy sources, regardless of whether we do it for climate change purposes or because we have to, because the resources are getting harder and harder to find. Now, I've integrated these things up, and you can compare them to what's called the resource base. Resource base is the greatest amount of, let's say, oil that you could conceive of ever recovering. The oil that would be outside of the resource base would be just too widely dispersed that you'd never be able to capture it. Economists have looked at this and identified the resource base for oil and natural gas and coal. Coal is huge. Natural gas is moderate sized, and oil is moderate sized. In the transition, the natural gas transition, we will have consumed essentially all of our resource base of natural gas, and a substantial over 50% of our resource base for oil would be consumed in either the natural gas transition or the business as usual transition. Low carbon fast, you'd consume less. To give you some idea of what we're talking about here, the business as usual consumption of oil would the resource base for oil is considered to be something like 6 trillion barrels of oil. We've consumed less than 1 trillion in the hydrocarbon era so far, and most people think that in terms of economic recovery, reserves, resources, not resource base, but resources, we have maybe another trillion barrels of oil yet to be produced. So you have this peak oil concept, we're about halfway to exhaustion, so on and so forth. Rogner's resource base is 3 times that. It's 6 trillion barrels. And the consumption over the scenarios that I've just talked about that consume oil consumes about half of that resource base of oil. So 3 trillion barrels of oil. And the resource base of gas and the substitute gas. On the other hand, we will have consumed over these transitions only about less than 20% of the resource base of coal, so we'll have plenty of coal left. A final way of looking at it is in terms of if you take the resource base, say we do consume the entire resource base of oil and gas, we will have put into the atmosphere in the process of combusting those resource bases of coal and gas about 2 pre-industrial atmospheres worth of CO2. On the other hand, if we consume or combust our coal, we put 6 pre-industrial atmospheres into of carbon, CO2 into the atmosphere. And so I think you can see just from this that, again, the risk to climate change and global warming comes from coal, not so much from oil and gas. And so if we can minimize the consumption of coal and we can maximize particularly the use in transition sense of gas, natural gas, we will be doing ourselves a huge favor in terms of climate change. And we're going to have to make this kind of a transition, at least for oil and gas, to zero carbon sources or other sources of energy because of resource exhaustion. If we get launched in, if India and China get launched into producing their coal resource, they probably will consume the entire resource base of coal before they stop and make a transition. So if we can position them to use the other fuels or encourage them to use the other fuels, which I think they would very much rather do anyway, because coal is a very, very polluting fuel, and natural gas is even much better than oil, particularly in cities, which they have huge cities. Just for environmental reasons and health reasons, I think they would be highly motivated to do that. So rather than making natural gas scary, we might help ourselves a lot by showing the world how you could produce gas in a responsible way and have all the benefits that would attend.